Good morning, Professor John. Good morning, Professor John.
Morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, great. Right.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to start. So I have to say a few words before I invite you for a formal talk. So it is today. I would like to welcome you all. I know the people from around the world is watching you right now, and thank you for joining this event. And we are going to have this great linguist. Not only he is linguist, but he is multi-dimensional expert in the world, working in different areas. So we are fortunate to have him with us today. So this is the Department of Linguistics at Aligarh Muslim University, which was founded in 1968. Since its inception, the department has been providing excellent teaching and in-depth research in linguistics with a special reference to Urdu. As the role of Urdu increased in various walks of life, the department realized its responsibility to gear itself towards providing scientific description of the Urdu language and producing materials needed for teaching and research of Urdu language. From the very beginning, the department provided postgraduate teaching and research facilities leading to MPhil and PhD degrees in linguistics. The Aligarh Muslim University is one of the very few universities which offer a full-fledged undergraduate course in linguistics in India. Ever since the undergraduate teaching was made available in the department, the academic activities of the department have accelerated. Every year, the Department of Linguistics organizes national and international seminars, conferences, webinars on issues of international significance. With this brief introductory remark, because those who have joined may not be knowing the Department of Linguistics at Aligarh Muslim University, now I would like to say a few words about our speaker, Professor John Baugh, like whom we were together at Washington University. Professor Baugh is a renowned linguist and currently serving as the Margaret Bush Wilson Professor in Arts and Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Baugh's primary research interest has been the social stratification of linguistic behavior in multicultural and multilingual nations. Initial interest in this area began with quantitative and experimental studies of linguistic variation among African Americans. These studies evolved into applied linguistic research devoted to policy issues in medicine, education, and law. Gradually, his analysis expanded to include populations who suffered various forms of linguistic discrimination, including deaf communities, as well as speakers of languages or dialects who lack fluency in dominant linguistic norms of their respective societies. Most of Professor Baugh's research is interdisciplinary, drawing extensively upon related work in the fields of anthropology, ethnography, linguistics, and sociology. These experimental investigations are tailored to have practical applications whenever possible. Recently, he has conducted studies of linguistic profiling over the telephone where callers seeking housing or other goods and services face discrimination due to stereotypes about their speech. Very often, these discriminatory acts have legal implications in civil and criminal court cases. In addition to his linguistic research, Professor Baugh directs the African and American Studies program, which strives to advance distinguished scholarship of and by the people of African descent, regardless of academic discipline. These administrative duties are collaborative and involve scholars and students across Washington University who work advanced teaching scholarship and public service throughout the African diaspora. With these few words, I would also like to note some of the or tell some of the prominent publications of Professor Baugh that includes Linguistics in Pursuit of Justice by Cambridge University Press in 2018, Talk in Black Talk, Language, Education and Social Change in 2007, Beyond Ebonics, Linguistics, Pride, Racial Prejudice by Oxford University Press in 2000, Out of Mouths of Slaves, African American Language and Education Malpractice. This work includes a foreword by William Leboff, the sociolinguist, and published by University of Texas in 1999. Beyond that, there is a very important article that considered as a feature article published by a Stanford Law and Policy Review in 2004 entitled Linguistic Profiling and the Law. With these few words, I would like to welcome Professor John Baugh to go ahead with his presentation today. He will be speaking on linguistic imperialism and linguistic profiling in global perspective. Thank you once again, Professor John Baugh, for giving us time and for joining at too early in the morning in US. I can completely understand it is very early to you in US. Thank you, and the stage is yours now, please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Warsi, and for the honor of your invitation and the opportunity to share my research with your colleagues. Before doing so, it was my good fortune to be able to share time on the same campus with Professor Warsi when he taught here at Washington University in St. Louis. And his contributions were tremendously beneficial. As some of you are likely to know, students in the United States who have not had opportunities to travel elsewhere are often isolated from many of the important issues impacting the rest of the world. And Professor Warsi's courses and experiences helped our students understand not only the situation in India better, but also his insightful views about language and society and his contributions to humanity, which are substantial and significant. I also know that he's very happy to be back home. We miss him in St. Louis, but I'm happy for him that he's making the important contributions that he described to you previously. My talk today, I believe I'm going to be talking for just under an hour, and I will be concentrating more on the issues of linguistic imperialism than linguistic profiling, but I will say some things about linguistic profiling as I proceed. Professor Warsi, can you take it to the next slide, please?
Dr. Nazrin, can you go for the next slide, please?
We're doing it.
You can take the help of Salim, please.
Well, in the interest of time, I'll just tell you what's on the next slide. So the next slide are my acknowledgements of the sponsors. My research historically has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the United States National Science Foundation. And I also wanted to acknowledge again the Department of Linguistics at your university, as well as Professor Warsi once again for his invitation. I'm going to just talk through the rest of the PowerPoint slides, and then that way it won't be, a distraction, right? So if you can, you can just stop sharing the PowerPoint and put the screen on me, and then I can, continue with the discussion, or you can keep the slide up, doesn't matter. So the slide after that is one that pays tribute to the founder of the university and his vision for Muslim education in India, which was really extraordinary and founded, I believe, in 1865. And that vision to bring education to the Muslim population in India was not only quite extraordinary, but you all who are affiliated with the university recognize the importance of that original contribution. My talk today, I'm inspired by Charles Dickens and his work, A Tale of Two Cities. And my presentation will be a tale of four nations. And the four nations that I plan to discuss are the United States. Okay, we're catching up on the slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's where we are. So we're going to talk about the United States, China, South Africa, and India. And I will essentially be going through each nation in three phases. What did the linguistic landscape in the nation look like before colonialism? What happened to the linguistic circumstances during British colonization? And then what are the linguistic circumstances in more modern times after independence from England? Next slide, please. No, that's too far. There should be one in between. That one. One more, keep going. Couple more. We want the one that one right there, because even though I'm going to be, no. Go back one, please. We don't want this one yet. We want the one before this one. This one. Okay. So one of the reasons for this slide is, even though I'm going to be talking about the influence of the British colonization and empire, the fact of the matter is that the British weren't the only ones to represent linguistic imperialism as a result of European colonization. And so on the left side of this slide, you're seeing the influence of Spain and the spread of Spanish in Mexico, California, and then some of the countries of South America. Also, there's a map of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is adjacent to the influence of French. And so France and its expansionism, heavily influenced by Napoleon, occupied the area that we in the United States was purchased by Thomas Jefferson, called the Louisiana Purchase. And then there's a map of Quebec in Canada. Canada has two official languages, French and English, and Quebec is one of the French-speaking areas. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that sets the stage for the balance of the discussion today, because the expansion of the British Empire and the spread of English throughout the world as a result of the expansion of the British Empire has resulted in the linguistic imperialism that I would like to describe today. And one of the consequences of linguistic imperialism is linguistic profiling. So linguistic profiling occurs, and it's a worldwide phenomena, when someone speaks in a dialect that is not only not one of the dominant dialects of an influential language in the country, but their particular manner of speaking is the subject of discrimination. And in the United States, that discrimination can take different forms. I began the work in the United States looking at housing discrimination against African Americans and Mexican Americans based on experiments that I did that grew out of my own childhood in Los Angeles, California. I am very fortunate, but when people look at me in the age of Barack Obama and they see my skin complexion, they mistakenly assume that I am biracial and they think I have one black parent and one white parent, and that's not the case. In my particular case, the racial mixing in my family happened during slavery on both sides of the family. I have no idea who my white ancestors are. Obviously, I have white ancestors. You can see me. I am a multiracial child, but the racial background that I have is not the result of the fact that men and women of different racial backgrounds were in love with each other. Under slavery, African women who were enslaved were often impregnated by their masters, and they had no choice as to the fact that they had to give birth to their children. I'm the product of that union on both sides, and the fact that African women were denied the opportunity under slavery to choose their sexual partners. And indeed, it's the suffering of African American women that is a great motivation for much of the work that I do. In the United States, no one works harder than African American women. And in our culture, we treat our mothers and our sisters and our wives with a great deal of respect, despite the stereotypes that you see on television and in other venues. And in my particular case, I want everyone to know that my African American identity is quite strong because of the fact that I'm aware every day of the sacrifice that many African American women had to suffer in order to give me my life. And so I'm very fortunate, but I'm also very grateful for the ancestors who suffered that provided the opportunities that I have now. And a great deal of the research that I do worldwide, trying to use linguistics to improve the human condition, is in tribute to those who are less fortunate and who don't always have an opportunity to speak for themselves or to gain better opportunities. And I discovered this initially because of the fact that I was able to escape linguistic profiling. You all hear me right now. You hear my voice. I sound like what I am, an American professor. But when people hear me speak, especially if they've never seen me before, they don't automatically assume that I'm African American. In fact, just the contrary. They often assume that I'm white. And so what happened at the beginning of the linguistic profiling research is I was a professor at the University of Texas, and I had been invited to spend a year at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences on the Stanford University campus. And when I went to that area to try to find housing for my family, I would call and I would explain that I was a visiting professor in the Palo Alto area, and I was either looking for an apartment or a house to rent. And in nearly every instance, I had no problem. But on approximately 4 or 5 occasions when I arrived in person, I was told that nothing was available. And some of you that had an opportunity to see my TED Talk observed me describing this in much more detail. But the fact of the matter is that when I got to some of these places and they could see me in person, they then tried to say that some mistake had taken place and that the apartment wasn't available. And I suspected that it had to do with my race. No one ever said, "Oh, I'm so very sorry. Now that I see you're an African American, we never rent to African Americans." Had they said that, I could have sued them. But they would always make up some other excuse. And so I began to conduct experiments that were looking at how the different dialects might trigger different responses. And because I grew up in Los Angeles in an inner city community with other African Americans and Latinos, I could modify my speech. You understand? I don't always sound like I'm a professor. If I'm hanging with my Black friends, I can modify my phonology, and y'all can hear right now that the way I'm talking right now doesn't sound the same as when I'm using my professional voice. Y en el español también, I have many Mexican friends, and when I talk to my Mexican friends, I can modify my phonology in that way. And so I conducted experiments where I manipulated my dialect and was able to demonstrate that the dominant dialect received preferential treatment in affluent communities. The work that I did that had racial implications also had implications for sexual discrimination. We conducted experiments where we could show that women who were pursuing executive positions at banks were told that jobs were not available when men were told that they were. So linguistic profiling doesn't just focus on race. We also saw instances of homophobia, where men who spoke in a stereotypical manner that was associated with gay speech felt that they had been the victims of discrimination based on stereotypes about their sexual orientation. And so depending upon the country that you're looking at, linguistic profiling will manifest itself in different ways, especially if a group of people speak in a distinctive manner that is recognized as a potential form of discrimination. So let me begin a little bit now with my overview of the 4 countries that we want to discuss today. So in the United States, as many of you know, before colonization, hundreds and hundreds of indigenous native languages existed, and not always in harmony. There were often instances where Native American groups were in conflict, but those conflicts were often solidified once borders were established and special circumstances for the groups were codified. So rivers and mountains and other natural barriers would often separate the groups that might have at one time been in conflict. But once colonization started to happen in the area that is now the United States, people from different parts of the world were colonizing the US. So the British obviously had a very strong influence settling in Massachusetts and in Jamestown, but also the Dutch and the Spanish and the French came to this area as well. And so eventually you saw a situation where English became the dominant language. And as English became the dominant language in the United States, that coincided with the Industrial Revolution. And that's one of the reasons that English is the dominant language in this country from coast to coast. But this is also, relatively speaking, a very young country. The Declaration of Independence was in 1776. In comparison to China and India, we're an infant country in comparison to the antiquity of those nations. And so during colonization, you're seeing English spread in terms of its influence. But after the Declaration of Independence, there was actually a debate among the founders of the nation as to whether or not English should be used, or whether or not, in fact, Ben Franklin suggested that we adopt German so that we could send a message to the British that we were truly rejecting that culture and King George's domination. Because so many people spoke English as their primary language, that never materialized. Also, at that particular time, French was the language of diplomacy. When Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin went to France as American diplomats, French was the language of diplomacy. And educated intellectuals during the colonial period in the United States were bilingual in English and in French. As time moved on within the United States and immigrants came from around the world, they often engaged in what we think of as subtractive bilingualism. That is to say, they began to abandon their heritage languages in favor of English. And for those who immigrated to the United States of their own volition, it would typically take a family 3 generations to make the transition from their heritage language, whether it be German or Polish, Italian, Japanese, or Korean. The second generation was typically bilingual. And then the third generation, to the extent possible, would adopt English. And the English that they would adopt was often influenced by the regional dialect in that area. So for those of you that have had opportunities to travel in the United States, you know that we have different regional dialects of American English. Those who are from the Northeast in New York and Boston sound very different than those in the South in Alabama and Mississippi. Texas is slightly different from other Southern varieties. And the Western United States is more or less homogeneous because that region was settled after, again, the Industrial Revolution. So the United States is a multilingual country where English is dominant. And ironically, after World War II, the United States was a factor in influencing the continuing imperialism of English that had begun under the British Empire. I would next like to move to what happened in China. And so when the British went to China, we saw that because of the location of Hong Kong being adjacent to the ocean, that Hong Kong was colonized in a way that English became dominant. And the domination of English in Hong Kong was influenced in part in other regions of the country as the British began to move into Beijing and other territories of China through military might. And so Chinese and the different varieties of Chinese were coexisting under the yoke of British expansionism. But the Chinese linguistic situation was really quite unique because there's a common writing system, but because of the size of the nation and the fact that so many of the different regional varieties of Chinese, at least in their spoken form, are mutually unintelligible, the colonial period saw regional bilingualism, with British English being the dominant imposed language from the outside, and then the regional provincial language being most influential locally. And as time moved on and the British still occupied the country, they centralized their influence in Hong Kong, where Cantonese and English coexisted. And then under the leadership of Chairman Mao, the revolution that took place to try to bring equality to China did so in a way that couldn't overcome the linguistic diversity in the nation. But what happened was Hong Kong, as you know, was still preserved as a British colony where bilingualism prevailed. And then as central China began to establish itself under communist rule and various iterations that evolved into the current modern China, we witnessed a situation where the central government in Beijing was promoting Mandarin as the primary language, but that was influenced more by governmental dictate than by the fact that people in the different regions in Shanghai and the Western provinces were willfully adopting were willfully adopting Mandarin. However, Mandarin is clearly the most influential language in China now. And politically, there are special issues with respect to Taiwan. All of you have witnessed the turmoil and political difficulties with Hong Kong. And there are linguistic issues that underlie a great deal of that when you look at the fact that the citizens of Hong Kong are often loyal to Cantonese, and Cantonese is seen in some ways as a form of linguistic rebellion against the mainstream government. However, because the mainstream government in Beijing is so influential in China, they're able to spread the influence of Mandarin in ways that are not really found in democratic societies where people have more linguistic choice. And so under those circumstances, China is now in a state of linguistic flux, but China also is trying very much to make Mandarin a world language. If you're familiar with the impact of Chinese businesses throughout different parts of Africa, in Ghana and Kenya and other African countries, the Chinese have come in and they've built roads, and they've built hospitals, and they've built schools. And each one of those schools very carefully teaches Mandarin, because the Chinese recognize that if the Chinese language is adopted as a second language by many people throughout the world, that not only enhances the prospects for Chinese business and their economy, it will influence their global stature and standing in the world. To a certain extent, without the benefit of having a colonial empire, modern China is trying to replicate what the British did under colonialism in terms of the expansionism and influence of Mandarin. So it's a fascinating situation and one that's interesting to watch and to observe. At this point, I'd like to talk about South Africa. But first, I need to take a drink. Sorry. So in South Africa, many of you know that the first group to colonize South Africa were the Dutch. And they set up a trading post in Cape Town. And that Dutch trading post in Cape Town was there for centuries and centuries under Dutch rule. And the Dutch and the Portuguese did not travel with women. When I talked about colonization in the United States, I failed to mention the important fact that the settlers who came here from England also brought their wives. Portuguese and Dutch explorers did not travel with women, and as a result of that fact, multiracial babies and the population that's now called colored in South Africa, that is mixed race, and many of those people look like me. When I'm in South Africa, people will often speak Afrikaans, assuming that I'm a mixed race South African. But the racial mixing was taking place almost immediately when the Dutch settled in Cape Town. And so that also was the beginning of the foundations of Afrikaans and the early dislocation of the indigenous Black population that was there. Then as time evolved, the Dutch and the British went to war in Europe, and one of the outcomes of that conflict was that the British ended up gaining control of South Africa. And so when the British gained control of South Africa, the Afrikaners moved east in what was known as the Voortrekker movement. And the Voortrekker movement in the 1800s in South Africa in many ways resembled the covered wagons and westward movement in the United States almost at that same period in time. And so the Voortrekkers went east and they were having wars with the indigenous Black population in the United States. The covered wagons moved west and they were at war with the indigenous Native American populations. Meanwhile, the British and the Dutch, not getting along, engaged in the Boer Wars that resulted in a dislocation among the white people in South Africa at that time, as the country found Afrikaans and the Dutch populations moving toward the east, and the British populations settling in Cape Town and then eventually establishing themselves in Johannesburg. And apartheid was very strongly established. And I'm hopping around a little bit. I apologize for not giving the full details of the South African situation. But one of the reasons that I'm doing so is that a significant population that moved to South Africa at some point in time was a South Asian population from India. And many of you know well that Gandhi ji, as an attorney, began his work for equality in South Africa. And Gandhi's influence on the struggle for racial equality in South Africa had global impact, not just in that country, not just in the United States, but also when he returned to India. But I want to say a little bit more about South Africa before I talk about Gandhiji's influence in South Africa and India. Because under apartheid, South Africa had two official languages, but they were minority languages. Afrikaans and English became the official languages of South Africa, despite the fact that majority Black populations existed there. And so under apartheid, the white government in Pretoria promoted what's called the Bantu Language Act. And the Bantu Language Act guaranteed that anyone living in South Africa could be educated in their mother tongue. But the problem with that for many of the Black South Africans is that Setswana and Zulu and Xhosa were not influential languages. Yes, they were indigenous languages, but they did not have the economic clout of either Afrikaans or English. And as a result of the Bantu Education Act, that guaranteed a permanent linguistic dislocation of the Black South Africans. And so that situation existed for many, many years until the end of apartheid. And the ANC under Nelson Mandela and all of their efforts to try to overthrow the white government, not only in his jailing, but the jailing of others who were Black in South Africa that were trying to promote racial equality under the yoke of apartheid. And many of you know that Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. But what was interesting was that when he gained his freedom and through the democratic process became the first elected Black South African president, South Africa also adopted an official language policy that then elevated the status of 9 of the indigenous languages along with English and Afrikaans, so that South Africa to this day has now 11 official languages in the aftermath of apartheid. And that doesn't mean that there's linguistic unity in South Africa, but rather there was an attempt by the ANC and President Mandela and a linguist named Neville Alexander at the University of Cape Town to be the architects of an official language policy that recognized that the regional indigenous languages of South Africa should not be subordinate to English or Afrikaans. And so they did implement that official language policy, and they've tried with some difficulty to elevate the status of the indigenous South African languages. But because of the fact that they are languages that are confined to South Africa, their economic utility is limited in comparison to English. And so when we look at the impact of English and the fact that English is a global language that's used for economic purposes in so many parts of the world, the official languages in South Africa in some ways are almost forced to be deferential to English. And the Afrikaner population, due to pride and their history of greater economic resources, have done a great deal to preserve Afrikaans in South Africa. And so the linguistic landscape in South Africa has been greatly influenced by the changing political circumstances there. And as I mentioned previously, historically, the fact that a South Asian population was there and influential and well-educated forced South Africa to wrestle with its racial discrimination. And Gandhi was able to have South Africans begin to have conversations that at least open the door to a recognition that racial discrimination was not fair, inappropriate, and yet because the white population dominated through military might, Gandhi's influence, while it had a great impact intellectually and to a smaller extent legally, did not result in any immediate change. And as you know, Gandhi then left South Africa to return to India. And at the time that he returned to India, the British influence was extraordinary in your country. And India, like China, is a country that is steeped in a multilingual past that traces its ancestry to royal families with extraordinary wealth and a stratified society based on caste that was codified and long-standing. And to a certain extent, the British, recognizing some of the divisions that existed in India prior to their arrival, exploited that. There's also another phenomena that happened in China, in South Africa, and India with the British soldiers that came to your countries, to those countries. And the fact of the matter is that the British society is highly stratified with the royal family at the top and various other working and lower classes at the bottom. And they're linguistically distinct, where the Cockney speakers are the least well-educated. And the military soldiers, even though some of the officers came from the upper classes in England, for the most part, British soldiers were from the working classes. But although they were working class in England, they tried to gain the pretenses of the British upper class in their colonial situations. And so in China, India, and South Africa, you see the British with opulent homes and servants and exploiting the local populations to try to emulate the upper class British lifestyle. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that India also adopted cricket. And now you master cricket. You beat the British. And so much like English has come to India and is an influential language there, now the British are very sorry they ever taught you how to play cricket, because you've taught them that you can beat them at their own game, at least in terms of the sport of cricket. But also economically, what you're seeing now is India is an extraordinarily successful country from the standpoint of technological advancements. For the majority of my career, I was a professor at Stanford University. And many of our most outstanding students came from India. Outstanding intellectuals with tremendous abilities from the standpoint of technology, medicine, legal scholars, literary scholars. And that intellectual tradition is multilingual and multifaceted in India that exist in extraordinary ways. In my book, Linguistics in Pursuit of Justice, there's an important section where I actually talk about Gandhi's linguistic influence. And on the one hand, we're talking about linguistic imperialism, where the British not only spread their culture and language and English schools, but as they spread their language, in some instances, individuals who were able to master English were able to weaponize it against the British. And that's what Gandhi did. And my book talks about the fact that Gandhiji's Salt March, the Salt March was one of the most revolutionary acts ever seen anywhere in the world. And his 200-mile walk was one of the most frightening things that ever happened to the British. And it transformed your country. When he showed that you could go and make salt without paying a tax, that sent shudders through the British military, because they realized that India was a sleeping giant and that they couldn't really control India without the tacit cooperation of the Indian populations. Now, because India is a democratic society, it's not like China in the sense that any one group can say that we want our language to be the national language. And I was very pleased to hear Professor Warsi introduce his lecture by talking about the importance of Urdu and how his department is providing an infrastructure that supports the study of Urdu, its significance, and its viability as a language in your country. And so what we see when you look at the history of India, in Tamil, in Bhojpuri, and Hindi, and the different factions in terms of the caste system, it isn't easy to unite India. And I understand that. In the United States, we're also a very divided country, but we're divided for different reasons. In India, you see those divisions going so far back historically that efforts to unify the country have an ironic twist when it comes to the English language. And I say that it's ironic because I don't think you all agree on becoming a country with 5 official languages or 6 official languages like South Africa did. Rather, well-educated Indians are at least bilingual, perhaps trilingual, in their heritage language and English. And that's not only a sign of your intellectual might, but it's also a sign of the political circumstances in your great country where the struggle for unity, if it results ever in the eventual harmony of the Indian people, you're going to be the most powerful country in the world if you can find a way to unite. And I want to conclude my remarks by talking a little bit about how your university and your country have influenced the struggle for racial equality in the United States. Many of you know about Martin Luther King, and many of you know about Malcolm X. And they were both very active in the civil rights struggle in the United States. And Martin Luther King was emulating the work of Gandhi. Martin Luther King, studying the way in which Gandhi challenged the British in India, tried to use the very same nonviolent techniques to challenge racial discrimination in the United States. And by contrast, Malcolm X had studied the Holy Quran and the word of the Prophet. And Malcolm X, under the influence of his devout devotion to Islam, recognized that the United States wasn't living up to many of the principles that the Honorable Prophet promoted in the Quran, that promoted the well-being of humanity and a faith that cherishes the contributions that many, many people can provide if they lead a life that is worthy and supportive of their fellow human beings. And so even though Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were approaching the struggle for racial equality in the United States differently, both of them were influenced by traditions in India that were influenced not only by Gandhi, but also the important tradition of Islam in the country that promotes humanity trying to strive for harmony. And it's on that note that I want to stop, and I'm happy to entertain questions if you like. I have tried to cover the linguistic landscape in different parts of the world, but I want to conclude with respect and admiration for your country, your contributions to the world, and the fact that so much of what you're doing that's beneficial for the entire world right now is greatly appreciated. And I want to thank Professor Warsi once again, and to all of you who honor me with your presence today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John, for the wonderful lecture. And we were so excited since long to hear this, and you have made us so feel good, so that we have like pin drop silence, the people who are listening, and certainly there are questions that people are would like to ask. But before, and I would like to first thank you for the wonderful lecture that you delivered, and we were expecting that a scholar like of your repute, like always do justice with your lectures, and it is such a learning experience for all of us, like particularly when we talk in multi-country level, like the effort when you talk about China, Canada, like India and United States. So like these are the experiences that one can expand their horizon of understanding things. Now, uh, I I will start with a question. It is not a question, just for the information that I was reading somewhere about that you mentioned about Martin Luther King Jr. He said, if I would count the one impact on our life, it is Mahatma Gandhi. So he gave so much respect, or so much he has learned. And so could you please explain a little more what what the impact that he has got from Mahatma, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi's linguistic influence or his non-violence influence or his like the march that you refer to in your talk, Dandi March or Salt March, like we call it Namak March or something like that. To pay without paying tax to prepare salt. So could you please shed some light on that?
Well, the easiest thing I could say in response to your comments are yes, yes, and yes. So, from a linguistic point of view, Gandhi's command of English was so powerful that in argumentation with British intellectuals who were trying to justify and rationalize the imposition of colonial might, Gandhi's intellect and command of English was so eloquent that he was far more masterful. Also, there was one speech that Gandhi gave before the Salt March, which was really quite compelling because he anticipated the possibility of losing his life along the way. And by talking about the fact that he was prepared to die for a cause that he believed in, put the British in a very awkward situation. The British weren't very happy about everything that Gandhi had been doing. It was causing problems for them. But they also realized that if he was harmed, especially if he was harmed by the British, that would result in a revolution. And so not only did he have linguistic mastery, he was tactically wise in terms of knowing how his linguistic skills were. There's an expression, the pen is mightier than the sword. And in Gandhi's case, his speech was more powerful than the British guns, right? And then the march itself. Well, Martin Luther King marched. And so what you're seeing is, on the one hand, now in Martin Luther King's case, it's a really fascinating linguistic exercise because Martin Luther King, his phonology is African American, but his grammar is standard English. So for a linguist like myself, we know that many of the slave descendants often use certain expressions that are not really common among well-educated speakers of American English. So one that's very productive, for example, is the use of habitual be. Many African Americans speaking their dialect will say, "we be happy," as opposed to "we happy." "We be happy" means you're happy all of the time. It's a very productive grammatical form, and it actually came in by way of African languages and a reinterpretation of the Scots and Irish indentured servants that oversaw the slaves because they used that form of be in their dialect, right? So even though the use of be has a fascinating linguistic history, it's also marked in the US as being highly non-standard. And when a speaker uses it, they're also seen as being less well educated. Well, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, they never used the non-standard grammar. Their phonology and their cadence was influenced by Black culture, but their grammar was that of the educated elite. And that was also another influence from Gandhi, that you had to control the language of the dominant group, right? And then the marches also resulted, the Salt March was the equivalent of the Montgomery bus boycott, right? In other words, how can you impact the economy of the dominant group? And so Martin Luther King took all three of those messages away from Gandhi and utilized them very effectively in the United States, so much so that our government was embarrassed when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? Okay. Thank you for that question.
Okay. Thank you for elaborating such a nicer way. I have many questions from the audience, but I will take. I know it is time is up, so I will take few questions. The first one is, what underlies linguistic profiling? Is it conscious or unconscious?
It depends on the situation, but when it's conscious, it's very, very bad. And the occasions where it happens where it's conscious is often because it's difficult to prove in court. So excuse me, before I began this work, excuse me, the United States courts were only equipped to deal with face-to-face discrimination. In other words, someone could say, I applied for the job, they could see I was African American, and they denied the job. But when someone discriminates against you over the telephone and they've never seen you, then how do you know that they suspected you were a member of the minority group? Well, it's because of how people sound, right? And because of the fact that there are so many distinctive dialects, there are instances where people can discriminate consciously. They know they're discriminating against you, and yet they will deny that it's based on race or that it's based on sex. In other instances, it's subconscious and results in the situation where people simply have different linguistic preferences and they're not really aware of the fact that the biases that they feel actually have negative consequences for other people. And I can stay a little longer, so we don't have to stop, unless you have to stop at the top of the hour, I can talk a little longer.
I have to take few more questions. So, thank you for explaining. There is another question, dealing with the problems of society and the people is one thing, and dealing with the mindset of the people is another thing. Which is more challenging to deal with?
I think dealing with the mindset is more complicated because linguistic bigotry, many of the people that are promoting linguistic profiling don't think of themselves as bad people who are discriminating. So, for example, in the United States, some of the most egregious people with respect to linguistic discrimination are teachers of English. They feel that they're actually protecting the English language by trying to help students eliminate or change their dialects. But the fact of the matter is, the United States should really be accepting of many different ways of speaking English because our country is founded by people that come from all over the world. And the varieties of English that are spoken here are influenced by the different heritage languages. And so I recognized early on as a slave descendant that if I talk like a Black person, I was only going to get so far in society, you understand? So I had to learn to control the dominant linguistic norm. But in so doing, I'm in a position to talk about the fact that linguistic unfairness is profound and it weakens us. It doesn't strengthen us.
Thank you so much. I have another questions from the audience. It says, as you have mentioned about the linguistic imperialism in United States, China, South Africa, and India, how do you see the linguistic imperialism in the case of Mauritius?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
It says like you have talked about the linguistic imperialism in United States, China, South Africa, and India. Now the question is, how do you see the linguistic imperialism in a country like Mauritius?
Oh my. Well,
There is also like migration.
yeah, no. I understand the question, and I don't know enough about the linguistic situation in Mauritius to answer that fairly. I know that Mauritius is, for many people a tourist destination, and that as a result of that, it has, a complex situation in terms of the indigenous population and the need for its economy to support the tourist industry. But I'm not as familiar with the linguistic infrastructure as I should be to answer that question fairly. So I apologize.
It's all right, sir. I'm just reading from the chat box. There is a question that is first. It says, "Thank you very much for the illuminating lecture, sir." And he says, "We often talk about decolonizing multilingualism in the context of linguistic imperialism. Is it practically possible, sir, to decolonize a linguistic situation where English has been imposed as every setup? How mother tongue re- revalorization is possible in such a horrible situation?"
So, Professor Warsi, can you answer that question with respect to how you support Urdu at your university?
We always support, sir, the language preferences, whatever language they are learning, they are going through. But linguistic imperialism, when we talk about India, is a different case because we are multilingual country where every other miles there is another language, and so we claim that we are the richest linguistic nation in the world. But there is always ups and downs. Like when we talk about in India, when we talk about Urdu, every other language has a state of its representation. Most of the languages, like we have Dravidian languages, these are spoken in 4 different states. We have Kashmiri spoken in Kashmir. We have Odia spoken in Odia. But there is no like a separate geographical boundary where we can say the Urdu is spoken here. Like so, Urdu we call it as a pan-Indian language. Where so how we can describe the linguistic situation like in a
Oh,
multilingual
and
situation.
also the point that I was making, and I said it very quickly before, but because you're a democratic country, people have a linguistic choice in the way that in China, the central government is simply elevating one of the languages, right? And you can't do that in India, right? As a democratic society, people have different opportunities. It's a very good question. And what we see in South Africa is an attempt to be pragmatic and recognize that English is a world language. Having control over English allows you to travel in different parts of the world and have a communication system. But elevating your mother tongue is also very important. The linguistic loyalty to anyone's heritage should be honored and respected. And in South Africa, under apartheid, you saw a very interesting tradition among the whites. And whites of English background would learn Afrikaans, and Afrikaners would learn English. And they did that as a sign of respect for the other group. Because India has so many different languages, I don't think it's practical for everybody to try to learn all of the local languages, right? Especially when you recognize that there are regional enclaves with respect to how they're used, but preserving the linguistic heritage of India, I think, is hugely important and beneficial. And I would just like to see it done in harmony and respect, right? So that there isn't a tendency for a group to feel like, okay, not only are we preserving our language, but our group is somehow better than another group, and that's why I said, if India could find a way to promote harmony nationally, you're unstoppable. Okay. Because a united India has more intellectual power than any other country in the world, including the United States. Our educational system is terrible here. Why? Because it's intentionally designed to perpetuate the class structure. Each state has control over the education. So what's required in Texas is different from Connecticut, which is different from Massachusetts. And we also have a situation similar to other countries where the wealthiest people send their children to private schools to make sure they get the best education. I know there's some of that in India as well, right? But the public education system in the United States does not promote harmony and does not provide us with as much intellectual power as we might have. You know, it's interesting in my particular case, when I was a high school student, all of my high school counselors told me I should be an auto mechanic. None of them told me I should go to college. Okay? So that's a sign of the fact that racism perpetuates disunity. So I want to encourage you to try to find ways to support each other and be harmonious, because right now you're producing so many wonderful things and doing so with, you know, the best computer programmers I know all come from India, right? There's a reason that, you know, so many American companies come to you to support our call centers, right? I got up early today, but there are many people in India that will be up late tonight on the telephone talking English to other parts of the world, because it's not only economically viable, but your English is comprehensible in other parts of the world as well. Okay, so, you know.
Thank you so much, Professor John, for this enlightened lecture. And just to add that our government this year, they introduced a new education policy where they have put emphasis on to promote and to propagate the regional languages, local languages, or like mother tongue. So they are giving emphasis on that part to preserve their cultural and linguistic heritage. So with these words, I must thank you all. With a brief, we are going to have another lecture by a distinguished linguist, Stephen Koreshan, on November 23rd. So this is another one. So thank you for this wonderful lecture. I would like to request now Dr. Nazreen Laskar to propose vote of thanks. Dr. Nazreen Laskar, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. I, on behalf of the Department of Linguistics, Aligarh Muslim University, and on my own behalf, thank Professor John Baugh from Washington University, St. Louis in USA, for accepting our invitation to deliver a web talk on a topic that resonates very well with the Indian audience. We are very grateful to you, sir, for your very erudite and illuminating talk. We look forward to your association with our department. I extend my heartfelt thanks to our attendees. Without your support and enthusiasm, it would not have been possible to organize such academic programs. Professor Jahangir Warsi, Chairperson, Department of Linguistics, took the initiative of organizing a series of web talks during the pandemic to keep the academic tempo going. We appreciate and value all your efforts. I also thank our Vice Chancellor for always inspiring us to strive for excellence. I'm grateful to all my colleagues in the department for their valuable advice and assistance. The office staff deserves special mention for all their efforts. Thank you. And with this, we end this program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and very good morning to Professor John, and good evening to all the audience throughout the group. Thank you very much.